The doorbell rang at 11:17 on a Tuesday morning, and Bridget Osei knew, before she even crossed the hallway, that it was going to be him. She'd felt it the way you feel a drop in temperature before a storm rolls in off Lake Ontario. That particular tightening in the chest. A kind of atmospheric knowing. She set down her coffee mug, dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and walked to the door without hurrying. She had learned, over the past 3 years, that hurrying was a form of surrender. Through the frosted sidelight panel, she could already make out 2 shapes, one tall and familiar in that expensive coat way, one smaller, brighter blonde. She opened the door. Bridget. Vincent Lowe said her name like it was an obligation. He was 51 and looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent 30 years believing his own press. The silver at his temples was artfully maintained. His overcoat was cashmere, his new girlfriend, standing half a step behind him and slightly to the left in the way. Women stand when they've been told their job is to be decorative. Was wearing a camel-colored wrap dress that cost more than Bridget's electric bill. The girlfriend. Bridget had heard she went by Tara. She filed this information away without expression. Looked at the house the way people look at things they've already decided not to like. A quick, dismissive scan. The peeling gray paint on the porch railing. The garden still mostly brown and matted from winter, just barely starting to push through in patches. The front door itself, which Bridget had repainted last October in a deep forest green that she loved, but which she suspected looked eccentric to people like Tara. Vincent, Bridget said. Not a question, not a welcome. Just an acknowledgement that he existed and was currently standing on her porch. We were in the neighborhood, he said, which they both knew was a lie. Vincent had not voluntarily been in this neighborhood in the 2.5 years since their marriage ended. The firm's offices were on Bay Street. He lived in a condo in Yorkville that had a concierge and a gym and a view of the city that he had described to her, during their marriage, as an investment in perspective. This neighborhood, a quiet residential street in the West End of Toronto, the kind of street where people actually lived in their houses and knew their neighbors' names, had never been on Vincent's radar. The paperwork, he said, reaching into the interior pocket of his coat. From the mediation. My lawyer said you hadn't returned the final copy. Bridget looked at the envelope he was holding out to her. She had, in fact, signed it 4 days ago and left a voicemail for his lawyer. She did not say this yet. You drove out here yourself, she said, to deliver paperwork. Something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt. Vincent didn't do guilt. She'd figured that out somewhere around year 7 of their 12 together. What flickered was closer to calculation, a quick resorting of the approach. He'd come here for a reason, and the paperwork was only the thinnest possible pretext for it. Tara touched his arm. The gesture was proprietary and practiced, and Bridget watched it with the mild detachment of a woman who no longer had anything invested in the performance. We thought we'd check in, Tara said. Her voice was bright in the way that suggested significant effort. She had a slight Quebecois lilt under the standard Canadian vowels. From Montreal originally, Bridget guessed, or maybe the Eastern Townships. She was probably 33, maybe 34. She had the kind of beauty that demanded a lot of maintenance and received it. Vincent mentioned the house was. He was worried about you, honestly. Managing everything on your own. There it was. Bridget let a small silence sit between them. Not an awkward silence. She was past awkward. Just a silence that let the sentence breathe long enough that everyone could appreciate exactly what it meant. Managing everything on your own. In a house this small. In a neighborhood like this. With a garden that's still half dead. She looked at Tara steadily. That's thoughtful, she said, and stepped back from the doorway. Come in. She said it the way you offer tea to someone you're entirely comfortable with. No performance. No brace. She simply moved out of the frame of the door and went back into the house, and after a moment, she could feel the brief hesitation, a recalibration. Neither of them quite expected to be invited in. They followed. The house at 14 Marguerite Avenue had been built in 1923, a fact that Bridget had discovered in the second week after she moved in, and which had filled her with a disproportionate amount of satisfaction. There was something she found quietly thrilling about the idea that the house had been standing long before she existed, and would, if treated with care, stand long after. It had been a wreck when she bought it. Not a charming wreck, not the kind that shows up in weekend renovation features in the Globe and Mail, all salvageable bones and good light. It had been genuinely sad. The previous owners had covered the original hardwood in laminate. They had installed drop ceilings in every room. Someone, at some point in the early 90s, had tiled the kitchen in a shade of green that had no name in any language Bridget had ever spoken. She had bought it anyway, because it was what she could afford after the settlement, and because something about its stubbornness appealed to her. It had been through a lot. It was still standing. She had spent the first year barely touching the structure itself, just learning the house, how it breathed in winter, where the light came from in the morning, in the afternoon, at the particular angle of 6 o'clock on an October evening, when the whole main floor turned amber and she sat. The kitchen table and sometimes cried and sometimes didn't. She'd gotten good at sitting with a place before deciding what it needed. Then she'd started. Slowly, methodically, on a budget that she tracked in a notebook rather than a spreadsheet, because she needed to feel like it was something she was building by hand. She'd stripped the laminate herself. The hardwood underneath was white oak, original, and it came back like something waking up. Not perfect, not showroom perfect, but warm and honest and real in a way that floored her. The first morning she walked across it in bare feet. She'd taken down the drop ceilings one room at a time. She'd plastered and painted. She'd learned to reglaze old windows. She'd called in trades for the things she couldn't do herself. The electrical, the structural work on the back addition. But she'd supervised everything personally, which meant she'd spent a lot of Saturdays in paint-stained jeans arguing cheerfully with contractors, who eventually, to a man, came around to her view. The kitchen was last. She'd lived with the green tiles for 14 months, which her friend Corinne called an act of discipline, and which Bridget thought of more as a decision to earn it. When she finally did the kitchen, she did it right. White oak cabinets to match the floors, soapstone countertops, a farmhouse sink salvaged from a place up in Gray County, open shelving above the counter where she kept her grandmother's pottery and her growing collection of cast iron. She had not in any of this once thought about what Vincent would think. That was how she knew she was going to be okay. Tara stopped in the front hallway, and for one genuinely unguarded moment, her rehearsed brightness slipped. She looked at the archway into the living room, at the exposed plaster walls, painted a warm white, at the original fireplace with its beveled tile surround, at the floor glowing in the weak March light coming through the tall front windows. And her voice did something Bridget hadn't expected. It softened. "This is beautiful," Tara said. It was involuntary. Bridget could tell because Tara looked mildly annoyed at herself immediately afterward. Vincent said nothing. He was standing in the entrance hall, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the space with an expression Bridget recognized from their marriage, the particular set of his jaw when he'd made an assessment he hadn't prepared himself to revise. "I'll put the kettle on," Bridget said. "Leave your coats." She went down the hallway into the kitchen. She filled the kettle at the farmhouse sink and set it on the gas range and got 3 mugs down from the open shelving. She didn't rush. She could hear them behind her, moving into the living room, taking in the built-in bookshelves she'd had made by a carpenter in Etobicoke, who'd done the joinery by hand. She could hear the floorboards, the ones she'd refinished herself, on her knees, with a rented edger and approximately 40 YouTube tutorials. Register their weight. "The floors," Tara said, from the living room. "Are they original?" "They are," Bridget called back and left it there. She made the tea, Earl Grey, because she'd stopped buying the expensive imported loose leaf after the divorce. Not because she couldn't afford it, but because she'd realized the expensive imported loose leaf had been Vincent's preference, which she'd absorbed so completely over 12 years that she'd forgotten it wasn't hers. She'd switched to Earl Grey and discovered she liked it better. Small things like that had made up most of her recovery. She carried the mugs into the living room on a wooden tray she'd found at the antique market on Queen West. Vincent and Tara were standing near the fireplace. Tara was looking at the mantel, at the photograph of Bridget's mother, a small piece of carved soapstone she'd bought from an Inuit artist at a gallery in Ottawa, a vase of dried grasses from last summer's garden. Vincent was looking at the photograph. Bridget knew which one. It was from 2 summers ago, herself and her daughter Margot and Margot's boyfriend, the 3 of them on the dock at her sister's cottage in the Muskokas, laughing at something off-camera. Bridget had a plate of corn on the cob in her hands and was wearing an old blue linen shirt, and she knew this because people had mentioned it more than once, like a woman who had no idea how happy she was. She set the tray down on the coffee table. "Sit down," she said, and meant it the way she meant most things now. Not as a performance, just an invitation. They sat. She poured. For a moment there was just the ordinary sound of it. Then Vincent said, "The place has come a long way." His tone was careful. He was trying, she could tell, to be magnanimous, as if the house were a project she'd attempted, and he was grading the outcome. "I wasn't sure what you were going to do with it when you bought it." Bridget wrapped her hands around her mug. "I know," she said. And then, because she was not angry, she had been angry, enormously and justifiably angry, for about 14 months, and she had come out the other side of it with something that felt cleaner. She just let his sentence be what it was, and didn't answer it. Tara set down her mug. She looked around the room again, the shelves, the fireplace, the quality of light through the old wavy glass windows. With an expression that was no longer performing anything, she looked, Bridget thought, like someone recalculating. "How long did it take?" Tara asked. "To do all of this?" 2.5 years, Bridget said. "More or less. You did it yourself?" "Genuine. Most of it." Tara looked at her hands briefly, then back at the room. "I didn't know you did that kind of work." "I didn't either," Bridget said, "until I had to figure out what I was capable of." She said it simply, and she meant it simply. She was not making a point to Vincent. She was not, as Corinne sometimes accused her of, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. She just answered the question she was asked, and the sentence happened to carry what it carried. Vincent put his mug down. He cleared his throat. "The garden's not quite there yet," he said. "No," Bridget agreed pleasantly. "March is March." "Right." He shifted in his chair. He had the look of a man who had arrived somewhere, expecting a particular kind of conversation, and was not finding the conditions for it. He'd come here. She understood this now with complete clarity, expecting to find her diminished, reduced, struggling in the particular visible way that would have confirmed whatever story he'd been telling himself about the choices he'd made. He'd brought Tara because Tara was evidence of his forward motion, and he'd wanted to set her next to Bridget like a contrast and call it a kindness. He had not expected the floors. He had not expected the fireplace tile, original, cleaned back to its 1923 colors. He had not expected the bookshelves with their handmade joinery, or the photograph of Bridget laughing on a dock in the Muskokas, or the fact that she'd offered him tea without a flicker of anything he could use. He had not expected to feel, in his ex-wife's small house on a residential street in the West End of Toronto, like a guest. "The upstairs," Tara said carefully, as if she was deciding whether she was allowed to ask. "Did you do all of that too? Would you like to see it?" Bridget asked. She took them upstairs the way she did everything, without drama, at her own pace, with the lights off in the rooms they weren't using because she'd gotten particular about light. She showed them the main bedroom first. She'd done it in a warm greige, plaster walls. The original trim painted a soft bone white. The bed was simple. A good solid wood frame she'd bought secondhand from an estate sale in Don Mills and refinished herself. The duvet was linen, the kind that gets better with washing. On the nightstand, a glass of water, a dog-eared novel, her reading glasses. Nothing in the room was expensive in the way Tara would recognize as expensive. But it had the quality that expensive things sometimes aspire to and rarely reach, the quality of being entirely chosen. Nothing was there by accident or by default. Every object was there because Bridget had decided she wanted it there, and that decision had taken either time or effort or both. Tara stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at the room for a long moment. Bridget watched her look. Then they went to the back of the house, to the room that had been the most significant decision of the renovation. The room Bridget had added on to the existing footprint of the house, pushing out the back wall into what had been a small, weedy patch of yard, building the addition herself in collaboration with an architect she'd met through a neighbor and trusted completely. It was a studio, 14 feet by 22, north-facing skylight running the full length of the ceiling, white plaster walls, with a slightly rough texture that caught the light differently at different times of day. A long wooden work table, shelves of materials, clay, plaster gauze, wire armature, tools. Along the east wall, arranged on simple wooden ledges, a series of ceramic pieces in various states of completion. Along the north wall, the ones that were finished. Tara walked into the room slowly, the way you walk into a space that rearranges something in you. "You made these," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did. I had no idea." She stopped, picked up one of the finished pieces from the shelf, a small vessel, about 20 centimeters, its surface marked by a technique that involved pressing fabric into the clay while wet, leaving a ghostly imprint of texture and fold. It sat in her hands like something that had weight beyond its actual weight. "Vincent, look at this." Vincent was standing in the center of the room. He was looking at the skylight. He had the expression of a man looking at something he can't categorize, which was a look Bridget had very rarely seen on him during their 12 years together, because Vincent did not, as a general rule, encounter things he couldn't categorize. "When did you start doing this?" he asked. "About 4 months after I moved in," Bridget said. "I took a class at a studio on Dundas. I just went once, then I kept going." She paused. "I showed at a gallery in Kensington last November. Sold 11 pieces." She said this without emphasis, the way she said most things, not to wound him, just because he'd asked. Vincent looked at her. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked at her without the soft, faintly protective condescension she'd learned to recognize over their marriage. The look that said, "I'm paying attention to you because you need someone to pay attention to you." He just looked at her, like a person who had done something he hadn't imagined she would do, and was now, slowly and without much grace, updating his imagination. "They're remarkable," Tara said. She set the vessel down carefully on its ledge. She sounded, for the first time since she'd arrived, like herself. Whoever that, Bridget found herself, briefly, feeling something not unlike kindness toward her. "Thank you," Bridget said. They went back downstairs. She refilled their mugs. They sat for another 20 minutes, and the conversation was strange and ordinary and nothing that needed to happen, and nothing that did any harm. Vincent signed the final document and left it on her coffee table, without mentioning that she'd apparently already returned it to his lawyer 4 days ago. She didn't mention it either. Some corrections aren't worth the breath. At the door, pulling on his coat, he looked at her and said, "You seem good, Bridget." "I am good," she said, simply, like the fact of it. Tara was on the porch already, looking at the front garden. The bulbs Bridget had planted last October were just barely showing. The first thin shoots of the tulips she'd ordered from a farm in the Holland Marsh, the tentative green tips of the alliums near the path. Not much yet. March in Ontario didn't give you much. But they were coming. "I love that you planted alliums," Tara said, and her voice had dropped its whole performance now, had come down to something quieter and real. "My grandmother grew them. They make you feel like something's going to happen." "That's exactly why I planted them," Bridget said. She watched them walk down the path to the car, a new Volvo, charcoal gray, that she could have named the exact price range of. She watched Vincent open the passenger door for Tara. She watched Tara get in and reach for the seatbelt. And she saw in that small domestic motion the shape of a life she no longer lived and no longer needed to live. She stood on her porch in the thin March sun for a moment after they left. The street was quiet. 2 doors down, her neighbor's kid was drawing something on the driveway in chalk. The forsythia in the yard across the road was starting to yellow up at the tips. In a week, maybe 2, it would be full gold. She went inside and left the door open to let the air in. She had not planned this. That was what she wanted people to understand. If she ever found the right way to say it, which she mostly didn't try to, because people's understanding had never been her most essential requirement. She had not planned to gut a century-old house and rebuild it by hand. She had not planned to take a ceramics class on a Wednesday evening in a church basement on Dundas West and discover, at the age of 41, that her hands knew how to make things she had never given them the chance to make. She had not planned a solo show in a Kensington gallery, or the piece that sold first, the large vessel with the creased surface, the one the gallery owner had put at the center of the space and lit in a way that made it look like it was breathing, or the woman in her 50s who'd bought it and left Bridget a handwritten note that said simply, "I know how this one felt to make." She had not planned any of it. What she had planned after Vincent left was to survive, to not need more than she had, to find out what she could actually carry and carry it. She sat at the kitchen table with her tea and the afternoon light coming through the window. She'd reglazed herself last spring, the one that looked out over the backyard, where she was slowly coaxing something into existence. A proper garden, not a magazine garden but a real one, with mistakes in it and experiments in it, and a compost bin that her daughter Margot referred to affectionately as the situation. And she thought about the look on Tara's face when she'd held the vessel. Not the first look. Not the curated look, the one that came preloaded. The second look, the one that snuck in behind the performance when Tara stopped being careful enough to keep it out. That was the look she made things for. Not for the person standing in front of the piece, necessarily, but for the moment when the person stopped performing and just responded. When the gap closed between what they thought they were supposed to feel and what they actually felt. She'd thought for a long time that she wasn't someone things happened to. She'd thought she was the person who managed the things that happened to other people. Practical, steady, good in a crisis, occasionally invisible in the way that capable women become invisible. She'd held Vincent's world together for 12 years, and done it so seamlessly that he'd stopped being able to see the seams. And when she'd walked out of his office the day she found out about Tara, and had sat in her car in the parking garage on Adelaide, and put her forehead against the steering wheel, and breathed what she'd felt underneath the grief and the anger and the ordinary devastating shock of betrayal had been very quietly something that took her months to name: relief. Not that it was over, not that it had happened this way, but that the seams could finally show, that she could finally be as unfinished and as imperfect and as unmanageable as she actually was, that she could live in a house with a half-dead garden and chalk dust on her hands, and a studio with the work in progress visible from the doorway, and a compost bin that her daughter called the situation, and a novel face down on the nightstand, and not one single thing in her life that was there. Because someone else expected it to be. The kettle had gone cold. She stood up and put it back on. Outside, the forsythia across the road was yellowing at the tips. The neighbor's kid was still drawing on the driveway, something large and ambitious involving what appeared to be a dragon. Her phone rang. It was Margot. "Hey," Bridget said. "Hey." Margot's voice had that particular Saturday morning ease to it, the one that meant she was somewhere comfortable with a coffee. "How's the city?" "Quiet. Cold. The alliums are starting." "Oh, good." Margot loved the alliums almost as much as Bridget did, which was one of those small inherited things that made Bridget feel, periodically, like she'd done something right. "Did Dad come by? He texted me something cryptic last night about stopping in." Bridget considered this. "He did, yes," she said. "He brought Tara." A pause. "And I made tea," Bridget said, and showed them the studio." Another pause, longer. She could hear Margot doing the math of this, the particular math that her daughter was very good at, the kind that involved reading between sentences for the emotional truth rather than the reported one. "Mom," Margot said finally. "Yeah, was it okay?" Bridget looked at the kitchen, at the white oak cabinets and the soapstone counters and the cast iron on the shelves and the window she'd reglazed herself, looking out over the garden that was still mostly potential. At the flour on the counter from yesterday's bread, at the small ceramic bowl she'd made in her third session at the Dundas studio, the one that was lopsided and absolutely not for sale, and that she used for keeping her keys in. "It was more than okay," she said. She meant it.